Right now, as you're watching this video, your entire way of life depends on a stretch of water so narrow that you could swim across it in about an hour, and most people have never even heard of it. Welcome to the Strait of Hormuz, the economic equivalent of a single thread holding up a massive chandelier, except that chandelier is the entire global economy, and someone just voted to cut the thread. Here's what I mean. This little waterway between Iran and Oman, just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, carries 20 million barrels of oil every single day. That's roughly 1 out of every 5 drops of oil consumed anywhere on planet Earth. But here's the first thing that'll blow your mind. If you think about oil like the blood flowing through the global economy's vein, then the Strait of Hormuz isn't just an artery. It's the main artery, and it's so skinny that if you stood on one side and squinted really hard, you could probably see the other side. Every morning when you wake up, whether you realize it or not, your coffee was probably shipped using fuel that passed through this strait. The plastic in your phone came from petrochemicals that floated through these waters. And even the fertilizer that grew your breakfast likely depended on this narrow channel that most people couldn't find on a map if their life depended on it. Now here's where it gets absolutely wild. About 84% of all that oil flowing through Hormuz is heading to Asia, specifically to China, India, Japan, and South Korea, which means that this tiny strait essentially controls whether billions of people across Asia can keep their lights on, their cars running, and their economies growing. Think about that for a second. One narrow waterway, smaller than the distance between most major cities, holds the economic fate of half the world's population in its hands. But oil isn't even the whole story. This strait also carries 20 to 30% of the world's liquefied natural gas, LNG, which is the stuff that heats homes, powers factories, and keeps entire nations from freezing in winter. It's like discovering that the entire internet depends on a single cable that runs through your neighbor's backyard, except in this case, the cable is made of water and the neighbor is Iran. And that brings us to what happened literally yesterday, June 22nd, 2025. After the US and Israel launched airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facility, Iran's parliament voted to close the Strait of Hormuz completely. Now, they still need approval from their Supreme National Security Council. But think about this. With a simple vote, a group of politicians just potentially threatened to turn off the tap that supplies 1/5 of the world's oil. It's like someone deciding to unplug the internet for the entire planet just to make a point. The moment this news broke, oil prices didn't just rise. They shot up like a rocket because traders know what most people don't. When you control the world's most important economic choke, you don't just control oil price, control inflation, interest rates, the cost of food, the price of everything that gets shipped, and basically whether the global economy thrives or crashes. But this is where it gets really crazy. Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz would hurt Iran more than almost anyone else. It's economic suicide disguised as a power move. Here's why. Iran also exports oil through this same strait. So closing it would be like a store owner burning down their own shop to spite a customer they don't like. The experts know this, which is why they think Iran's vote is mostly political theatre, a way of saying, look how much damage we could do without actually pulling the trigger. But here's the terrifying part. Even the threat of closure is enough to send oil prices from around $77 per barrel to potentially $100, $150, or even higher. And when oil prices spike like that, everything else gets more expensive. Your gas, your groceries, your Amazon deliveries, everything. Let me paint you a picture of what would actually happen if Iran followed through on this threat. Within hours, not days, oil prices would explode upward, and that explosion would ripple through the global economy like a financial tsunami. Countries like China, India, Japan, and South Korea, which depend heavily on oil flowing through Hormuz, would suddenly find themselves paying massive premiums for energy, which means their factories would cost more to run, their transportation would get more expensive, and their consumers would face higher prices for literally everything. The domino effect would hit manufacturing first, then agriculture, because modern farming depends heavily on oil-based fertilizers and diesel fuel, then transportation, then retail, until eventually your local coffee shop is charging more because their suppliers' trucks cost more to fuel. Central banks around the world would face an impossible choice: raise interest rates to fight inflation and risk crushing their economies, or keep rates low and watch inflation spiral out of control. Now, you might be thinking, surely there are backup plans, right? Well, there are, but they're like having a bicycle when you need a freight train. Saudi Arabia has a pipeline that can move about 5 million barrels per day to their Red Sea ports, completely bypassing the Persian Gulf. That sounds like a lot until you realize that's only 1/4 of what normally flows through Hormuz. The UAE has a similar pipeline that can handle about 1.5 million barrels per day. Add those together, throw in some strategic oil reserves that countries keep for emergencies, and you might be able to replace maybe half of what usually flows through the strait, but that still leaves a massive shortage that would send prices through the roof. It's like trying to replace a major highway with a couple of side streets. Technically possible, but traffic is going to be a nightmare. The really wild part is that this isn't just about oil companies or governments. This affects you directly in ways you probably never imagined. When energy prices spike, inflation follows. And when inflation rises, central banks typically respond by raising interest rates, which makes mortgages more expensive, credit cards more costly, and basically makes everything in your financial life more difficult. It's like an economic virus that starts in a narrow waterway in the Middle East and somehow ends up increasing your monthly payments. The countries that would hurt the most aren't necessarily the ones you'd expect. Sure, oil-importing nations would suffer, but even oil-exporting countries in the Gulf would see their revenues plummet because they couldn't get their product to market. It would be like having a gold mine, but no way to transport the gold to buyers. History actually gives us some clues about how this might play out. Back in the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, there was something called the Tanker War, where both countries attacked oil ships in the Persian Gulf. Prices spiked, but Western navies, led by the US, provided escorts for tankers, and oil kept flowing. More recently, in 2011 and 2012, Iran threatened to close Hormuz over sanctions. Oil prices nudged up about 2%, but nothing came of it because everyone knew Iran couldn't really afford to follow through, and military deterrence kept the strait open. The key lesson from these historical precedents is that markets hate uncertainty more than almost anything else, so even the threat of closure can move prices. But actual long-term closure is extremely difficult to maintain because too many powerful interests have too much to lose. So what's the real takeaway here? The Strait of Hormuz is essentially the global economy's most vulnerable point, a narrow channel of water that carries more economic weight than entire continents. It's proof that in our interconnected world, geography still matters more than most people realize. And sometimes the most important places are the ones you've never heard of. Whether Iran actually closes the strait or just keeps threatening to, this tiny waterway will continue to be the place where global economics, geopolitics, and geography collide in ways that affect every single person on Earth. The next time you fill up your gas tank, heat your home, or wonder why prices are going up, remember that somewhere in the Middle East, there's a stretch of water just 21 miles wide that might be the real reason behind it all.